Karen's 17-year-old daughter, Madison, was speeding down the road on a stolen ATV. Suddenly, she lost control, and the ATV slammed into a baby stroller. The child barely escaped serious harm, but the parents were left shaken to their core. Instead of owning up to her daughter's mistake, Karen began yelling at the baby's parents, blaming them as if it was all their fault. The sound still echoes in my head, the sharp squeal of tires, the metallic crunch that silenced an ordinary morning. I didn't see it right away, but I heard it. And then I saw the stroller, tipped on its side, its tiny wheels spinning as if time itself refused to stop. That image froze me in place. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. That stroller, that fragile reminder of innocence, nearly became the center of a tragedy because one spoiled teenager believed the rules didn't apply to her. That morning had started like any other. The garage door was open, sunlight spilling onto the concrete. I had been wiping down the seat of my pride and joy, an ATV I'd spent 6 long months restoring. Every bolt, every piece of paint carried hours of patience, sweat, and stubbornness. It wasn't just a machine. It was proof that when life tries to grind you down, you can still build something beautiful with your own hands. That ATV wasn't just an object. It was part of me. I didn't know yet that it would become a symbol for everything that was about to unravel. I felt her gaze before I even saw her. The kind of stare that doesn't just watch you, it tests you, needles at you, digs under your skin. I looked up and there she was. Madison Duke, 16 years old, the daughter of Karen Duke, our HOA president, the woman who ruled this neighborhood like it was her own private kingdom. Madison leaned against her mom's golf cart, the one with the little HOA president flag fluttering like a crown in the breeze. Her phone was already out, angled just right, recording like she was the star of a show no one else wanted to watch. That smirk on her face, it was the kind of smirk you only get after years of never being told no. "Nice toy," she said, her voice dripping with boredom, like she was doing me a favor by even speaking. "It's not a toy, Madison," I told her, keeping my tone flat, my hands busy on the ATV seat. I wasn't about to give her the reaction she was looking for. She took a step closer, her voice stretching with fake authority. "Driveway's common area technically. Mom says so. Bylaw 7, Section C." Her words sounded official, but they were just weapons handed down from her mother, a twisted gift of false rules used to keep everyone in line. I met her eyes and told her plainly that my driveway was mine, and stepping onto it would mean trespassing. She laughed, short and ugly, and let her gaze wander inside my garage. That was when her eyes found it. The magnetic key box. It was small, stuck to the side of a shelf. A tiny object meant for convenience, nothing more. But in that moment, I realized how dangerous a shortcut can be. My second mistake. Madison's smirk widened, and I could see the spark in her eyes. She knew what it was, and she knew I knew. That silent exchange between us was more powerful than any words. A gaze that told me she was about to take something from me just because she could. I turned my back, hoping she'd get bored, hoping she'd vanish like a shadow. That was my third mistake. The silence behind me stretched too long, too still. Then my phone buzzed. A motion alert from my garage camera. And there she was, caught in perfect clarity, sliding into my garage like she owned it, popping open the magnetic box and pulling out the key. She looked at the camera, her face lit up with pure joy. The joy of someone who thought she was untouchable. When I stepped outside, she was already on my ATV, sliding the key into the ignition with one hand, her phone raised in the other. The engine roared, shattering the quiet morning. She didn't wear a helmet. Of course not. A helmet would have ruined the moment. She looked over her shoulder, gave me a wink, and gunned it. My 6-month project, my symbol of patience and work, tore down the street under the control of a reckless teenager live-streaming her crime. I stood frozen for a moment. My blood didn't boil hot. It went cold. The kind of cold that sharpens everything. that strips away the noise and leaves only purpose. Pam, my wife, stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, her face lined with confusion. "Was that our ATV?" she asked. I showed her the notification, the clear footage of Madison stealing the key. Her eyes widened. "Call the police," and I did. Calm, steady, remembering my grandfather's words. Keep your head while everyone else is losing theirs. Madison was losing hers for an audience, but I couldn't. Someone had to stay centered. The dispatcher's voice filled my truck as I followed at exactly 25 mph, never speeding, just keeping her in sight. Up ahead, I saw her weaving across the lanes, her phone raised high, the ATV jerking wildly under her careless hand. I gave the dispatcher every detail. Green 2022 Can-Am Outlander, female driver, 16, no helmet, reckless. She was live streaming her crime, creating her own evidence. Pam, ever the strategist, was already pulling footage from our garage camera, logging into the AirTag I'd hidden inside the ATV's storage box. She tracked Madison's location in real time, a red line snaking across our neighborhood map. That ATV wasn't just a stolen machine. It had become a breadcrumb trail, recording everything Madison did. As I watched, Madison hit a roundabout too fast. The ATV tilted dangerously, two wheels lifting off the ground. For one heart-stopping second, I thought it would flip right there into the flower beds. But she corrected it, drunk on the thrill, blind to the danger. To her, it wasn't just a joyride. It was a performance, a declaration that she was above all of us, above every rule her mother had forced on the community. But rules don't break just for one person. They snap back, and when they do, the damage spreads. The police moved in, patrol cars boxing her in. Lights flashing, sirens screaming. Madison didn't stop. She panicked, turned hard, and cut down Willow Creek Lane, a small street where kids play and families walk their dogs. The danger spiked instantly. I told the dispatcher, my voice tight, my stomach in knots. I pulled over as ordered, letting the cruisers fly past me. My job was to be a witness, not a vigilante. Still, every instinct in me screamed to follow, to protect whoever was about to be in her path. And then I heard it. That sound. Tires screaming, a sickening crash. My blood ran cold. The stroller. The rosebush. A mother's scream. Sarah, a new mom from down the block, was on her knees clutching her baby to her chest, tears streaming down her face. The stroller lay on its side, its wheels still spinning. Madison had missed the child by inches. A fraction of a second stood between life and loss. And that was the moment everything changed. The neighborhood's quiet mask shattered. The Duke's illusion of untouchable power cracked open for everyone to see. Madison lay crying in the rosebush, her phone still clutched in her hand. But no one looked at her. Every eye was on Sarah, on the trembling child, on the wreckage that could have been a grave. That stroller became more than a stroller. It became a symbol. Proof of how fragile life is, how arrogance can nearly snuff it out, how the smallest decisions, an open garage door, a hidden key box, can lead to a moment that tests everyone's soul. And as Karen Duke arrived, her pastel tracksuit clashing against the wreckage of her daughter's actions, she didn't ask about Sarah. She didn't even glance at the overturned stroller. She went straight to Madison, crying out, "What did they do to you?" That was the instant the neighborhood turned. The gaze we shared, all of us, was one of silent pain and fury, not just at Madison, but at everything her family had stood for. I didn't know it yet, but that was the beginning of something more. Something that would tear down the illusion of power the Dukes had held for years. And in its place, something new would rise. But that part of the story, how justice came, slow and heavy, like a storm we'd been waiting on for too long, was still ahead. For now, all that remained was the sound of that stroller's wheels spinning, carrying the weight of everything we had lost and everything we were about to fight for. The stroller's wheel finally slowed, creaking to a stop, but the image of it kept spinning in my head. That sound, that frozen picture of innocence nearly crushed. became something I couldn't shake. It was more than just a close call. It was a scar etched into all of us who stood there. I knew right then that our neighborhood would never see Madison as just a bratty teenager again. From that moment forward, she was a danger, a reminder of how entitlement turns into destruction. And Karen Duke's reaction, her fury directed at everyone but her daughter, only deepened the wound. She had looked at us like we were the problem, like our anger was the crime, not her child's reckless theft. That was when I realized the past we had tolerated was colliding with the present in ways we could no longer ignore. For years, Karen had run this neighborhood like a queen with a crooked crown. Fines for mismatched paint, threats for holiday lights left up one day too long, constant letters that carried more venom than reason. Most of us swallowed it, telling ourselves it was easier to stay quiet, easier to let her tantrums slide than to confront them. But every look, every smirk from Madison was proof that silence had consequences. Karen wasn't just shaping rules. She was raising someone who believed there were none. Madison had grown up watching her mother bend reality, watching her get away with everything, and she wore that power like a weapon. The joyride wasn't just a rebellion. It was a performance, an inheritance of arrogance. I remember one evening months before this, standing on my lawn while Karen stood in front of Pam with a violation notice for our mailbox. The shade of black wasn't approved, she said, though the bylaws never mentioned paint colors for mailboxes. Pam had wanted to argue. I had wanted to laugh. But what stayed with me was Madison. She sat in the golf cart, chewing gum and recording the whole thing on her phone, her laughter spilling out every time Karen's threats got sharper. That was the moment I saw it. How Madison was learning not from school or friends, but from her mother's staged cruelty. She wasn't a rebel without cause. She was an apprentice, trained in entitlement. Now watching her wail in the rose bush while Karen shielded her from reality, I couldn't unsee that memory. This was the present paying the price for the past. Sarah's trembling arms around her baby were the cost of our silence, our willingness to let Karen and her family trample us just to avoid conflict. And as the crowd of neighbors grew, their faces set and hard, I knew I wasn't the only one remembering. The officer stepped in then, his calm authority cutting through the chaos. Karen tried to wave a paper in his face, some pathetic medical exemption she had printed and signed herself. It was laughable, almost surreal, like watching a stage play where the villain refuses to admit the curtain has already fallen. But beneath the humor was something darker. She had prepared that excuse. She had been ready with it. She had expected her daughter to cause trouble and had already crafted a shield. That meant this wasn't an accident. This was part of a pattern. Karen wasn't trying to protect Madison from the world. She was grooming her to believe consequences didn't exist. The officer didn't buy it. He handed the fake paper back to her with all the weight of disgust. And for the first time I saw a crack in Karen's armor. Her voice wavered. Her threats felt hollow. And in that brief flicker, I realized she wasn't invincible. She was scared. But scared people are often the most dangerous because they lash out in ways no one expects. That night, as the sirens faded and the police dragged Madison's wrecked ATV from the street, Pam and I sat at our kitchen table, exhaustion pressing down like a weight. Yet in that quiet, Pam's mind was already moving. She wasn't just angry. She was sharp, focused, and ready to dig deeper. Her fingers flew across her laptop, pulling together footage, screenshots, and the AirTag data. She wasn't looking at what had happened. She was connecting it to everything that had been happening. Madison's theft wasn't random. It was planned, sloppy maybe, but still planned. And Karen's excuse paper proved it. Pam found something else, too. Listings online that smelled wrong. Ads written in stiff HOA-style language offering compliance pickups for non-compliant vehicles, ATVs, dirt bikes. They carried fines disguised as holding fees. The language was vague, the sellers anonymous. But one name popped up. Gary Peterson, Karen's right-hand man on the HOA board. And suddenly the puzzle started to fit. Madison hadn't just taken my ATV for fun. She had been delivering it to a cul-de-sac, likely to load it onto a trailer for this scam. It wasn't rebellion. It was business. A family business built on intimidation and theft. I felt a sick chill when Pam showed me the ad that listed a $500 fee for reclaiming a non-compliant recreational vehicle. That was the number. They weren't just terrorizing us with fines. They were running a side racket, stealing property and then extorting people to get it back. Madison wasn't just a spoiled kid. She was the delivery driver for a con. What looks like a joyride on the surface can hide a scheme that has been quietly draining a community for years. The next evening, we set a trap with the police, using an old ATV from a friend. We parked it in the driveway, covered in a tarp, just enough to tempt them. Pam posed as an anonymous neighbor, tipping off the fake compliance ad. And right on schedule, a rusty flatbed truck rolled up with Gary and Gage, the so-called head of HOA security. They didn't even knock. They went straight to the ATV like they had done it 100 times before. I walked out with my coffee, keeping my voice calm as I asked what they were doing. Gage, with his hoodie and his cheap swagger, sneered at me and said, "Compliance pickup. Bylaw 11F." A bylaw that didn't exist. He stepped closer, his breath sour with arrogance, and shoved me. Not hard enough to knock me down, but enough to make a statement, enough to try and trigger me. I wanted to shove back. I wanted to wipe the smirk off his face, but I didn't. Instead, I raised my hands, calm, steady, and told him, "You just assaulted me, and you did it on camera." That was the moment the police moved in, swarming with sirens, boxing in the truck. Gage froze. Gary folded instantly, babbling about just following orders from Karen. The sting was clean, precise, and beautiful in its simplicity. But victories against people like Karen never last long. Because she wasn't on that street. She was too smart to be caught with her hands dirty. And when the evidence from the sting mysteriously went missing from the police locker, it was like the past reaching forward again to choke the present. Karen had connections, influence, enough arrogance to think she could make the truth disappear. That morning when Officer Miller called to tell us the SD card was gone, I felt my stomach drop. But Pam just pointed at our server rack. We had backups, automatic uploads, perfect untouchable copies. The truth was safe, but the theft of the evidence proved something else. Karen wasn't just playing dirty. She was desperate. And desperation makes people reckless. That recklessness would be her undoing. When the police searched her house with a warrant, they found the SD card in her purse, tucked in with her lipstick and car keys. Karen, the woman who prided herself on control, had personally stolen evidence from a police investigation. She thought she could bury it. Instead, she handed them the very proof of her corruption. When the powerful get sloppy, it's not their enemies who bring them down. It's their own arrogance. The fallout was brutal. Madison ended up in juvenile court, stripped of her bravado, sentenced to probation, community service, and restitution. Gage lost his security license, Gary took a plea deal. But Karen faced felony charges for evidence tampering. Her reign over the HOA ended in a single vote of no confidence. The same neighbors she had bullied for years finally stood together and stripped her of power. But here's where the past digs in again. For 5 years, Karen had built a culture of fear and silence. She had trained people to look the other way, to keep their heads down. And though she was gone, the echo of that fear lingered. People wondered if another Karen would rise, if the rot ran deeper than one family. The night after the vote, I sat on my porch, staring at my repaired ATV. It was more than a machine now. It had become a symbol, like that stroller, of what we almost lost and what we fought to reclaim. Pam sat beside me, her hand over mine, and she said something that stuck. We didn't just win, Cole. We changed the story. And now we have to protect it. Justice doesn't end with one arrest. It begins when people finally believe their voices matter. But even as I held on to that thought, even as the neighborhood started to feel lighter, I couldn't ignore the unease. Because Karen wasn't done. Her lawyer was already moving pieces, filing appeals, whispering threats of lawsuits. And then came the letter. Not from the HOA, not from her lawyer, but handwritten, slid under my door in the middle of the night. The words were short, jagged, almost desperate. You think you've won, but you don't know the whole game. That was the new threat. The reminder that sometimes the end of one battle is just the opening shot of the next. And as I held that letter in my hand, I knew the story wasn't over. Not for me, not for Pam, not for this neighborhood that had finally found its voice. The letter lay on the kitchen table, its edges curled slightly from the damp night air. Pam stared at it longer than I did, her jaw tight, her fingers drumming against the wood. I had faced engines catching fire in my grandfather's old garage, had stood in front of men angrier than they had any right to be, but nothing had ever unsettled me like this. Black ink scrawled in haste. Words that felt less like a warning and more like a wound reopened. You think you've won, but you don't know the whole game. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I kept replaying everything, the stroller, Madison's smirk, Karen's sunglasses hiding eyes that refused to see anything but their own reflection. But it was that letter that kept me awake. It wasn't just defiance. It was a promise. Somewhere in that neighborhood, while most houses slept quietly behind blinds, Karen or one of her allies had crept to my door, close enough to hear the hum of our refrigerator, close enough to breathe in the air that belonged to my family. That was an invasion deeper than a stolen ATV. It was a violation of safety itself. Pam didn't say much at first. She just sat beside me in the dim kitchen light, her laptop closed for once. But when she finally spoke, her words were sharp. They're not done, Cole. They've lost ground, but people like Karen don't let go. They double down. They try to break you where it hurts most. Your peace, your trust, your sense of home. Her voice cracked slightly on that last word. Home. It wasn't just bricks and drywall. It was supposed to be a place where you didn't have to look over your shoulder. That was my breaking point. Not the theft, not the crash, not even the missing evidence. It was that look in Pam's eyes, the quiet fear she tried to hide. I could handle anger, arrogance, even corruption. But fear in the one person who always steadied me, that was unbearable. I found myself questioning everything. Was I dragging her into a fight that would never end? Was standing against Karen worth putting a target on our family? A part of me wanted to walk away, sell the house, and leave this neighborhood to rot under the weight of its own corruption. But another part, the part my grandfather had drilled into me, whispered that walking away would mean they had won. And I wasn't ready to hand them that victory. Still, doubt clawed at me. I remembered a night years ago, back when I was a teenager myself. My father had wanted to challenge a shady contractor who was charging double for repairs after a storm. He had all the proof, all the receipts, but at the last moment he backed down. Not worth the trouble, he'd said. I remember the look in his eyes, though. It wasn't relief, it was shame. A shame that stuck to him for years, a quiet regret that ate at him in the silence between words. I didn't want that look. I didn't want Pam to see me become that man. But at the same time, the letter whispered another possibility. What if fighting Karen dragged us deeper into a storm we couldn't survive? That's when a knock came at the door. Not Karen, not the police. It was Tom, the father of the baby in the stroller. He stood there in the cold morning air, his eyes shadowed, his arms crossed tightly as if holding himself together. I let him in, and we sat in the same kitchen where the letter still rested. Tom wasn't a loud man. He had always been one of those neighbors who nodded from a distance, polite but reserved. Now his voice carried the weight of someone who had stared into a nightmare and barely walked away. "My wife doesn't sleep anymore," he said quietly. "Every time the baby cries, she jumps like it's about to happen again. And I keep asking myself, what if I had been the one pushing that stroller? Would I have been fast enough? Would my hands have been steady enough?" His voice broke. I can't shake the guilt. And it wasn't even my fault. That hit me like a hammer. Because in his guilt, I saw my own reflection. I wasn't the one who stole the ATV. I wasn't the one who nearly ran down a child. But guilt doesn't follow logic. It follows the heart. And my heart was heavy with the thought that if I had locked the garage, if I had hidden the key box better, if I had confronted Madison harder, maybe none of it would have happened. Guilt is a parasite. Once it finds a crack, it burrows deep. Tom leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "We can't let this slide, Cole. People like Karen, they thrive on silence. They'll find another way to push, another way to take. If we don't stand now, when will we?" Pam listened, her gaze moving between us. And for the first time, I saw something like fire in her expression. Not just strategy, but anger. Pure, righteous anger. "He's right," she said firmly. "This isn't about one family anymore. This is about all of us. And if we don't keep pushing, Karen will twist this into something else. She'll play the victim, spin her lies, and people will start doubting what they saw with their own eyes." What happens when silence is more dangerous than speaking out? Still, part of me resisted. Not because I didn't believe them, but because I knew what it meant. It meant risking more. It meant stepping further into the storm. And storms don't leave you untouched. Later that week, another confrontation cracked the calm. This time it wasn't Karen. It was Gage, released on bail, stripped of his badge, but still wearing his arrogance like armor. I caught him standing near my driveway at dusk, his hands in his pockets, his stance daring me to react. "You think this is over?" he asked, his voice low, sharp. "You think Karen's going down easy? You don't know her." I didn't respond. I just stared at him. And that silence, that refusal to take his bait, seemed to rattle him more than anger would have. He smirked, but his eyes flickered with uncertainty. "You've got a family," he muttered. "Think about that before you keep poking around where you don't belong." Then he walked off, leaving those words behind like smoke. That night, I couldn't shake the weight of his warning. He was right about one thing. I had a family, and protecting them had to come first. But what if protecting them meant exposing them to more danger? Was I being brave or was I being reckless? That question circled me like a hawk refusing to let go. Pam didn't hesitate, though. She pulled the neighborhood together in a way Karen never expected. House by house, conversation by conversation, she gathered people who had stories. Small humiliations, unfair fines, threats that had been swallowed in silence. Each story was another piece of a puzzle that showed how deep Karen's corruption went. And yet, in the middle of all that momentum, I felt myself cracking. I wanted to believe we were building something stronger, but I couldn't ignore the risks. I couldn't stop imagining another letter slipped under our door, another confrontation at dusk, another stroller knocked over but not missed this time. My mind played out every worst-case scenario, and I found myself withdrawing, quieter, more distant. That's when Pam finally called me out. One evening, she shut her laptop, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "Cole, you can't disappear on me now. I need you here. Not just physically. Here." Her voice shook slightly, not from weakness, but from raw honesty. "If you're scared, say it. If you're doubting, admit it. But don't stand beside me with your head somewhere else." Her words cut deeper than any threat Karen could have made. Because they were true. I had been drifting, letting my fear grow roots. And in that moment I realized something that shook me even more than the letter or the crash. The real battle wasn't just against Karen. It was inside me. What do you do when the real enemy isn't outside your home, but inside your own doubts? I confessed everything to her then, the guilt, the second-guessing, the memories of my father's silence. She listened without flinching, and when I finished, she said simply, "Then don't be him, be you. The man who rebuilt an ATV bolt by bolt. The man who keeps his head while others lose theirs. That's the man I need standing with me." Her words steadied me, but they also terrified me. Because now I knew I had no excuse. I couldn't hide behind doubt anymore. I had to act. The risky decision came 2 nights later. Pam wanted to present everything we had gathered. Videos, testimonies, proof of the fake compliance ads, directly to the police in one big package. But I hesitated. What if the system failed again? What if another SD card vanished? Another piece of evidence slipped away? So I did something reckless. I made copies. Not just one, dozens. Thumb drives, cloud uploads, encrypted backups. And then I delivered some of them directly to neighbors I trusted. People who had the most to lose, the most reason to fight. If the system failed, the truth wouldn't die with it. It was a dangerous move. If Karen found out, she would know I didn't trust the process. She would use it to paint me as paranoid, unstable. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this story was bigger than one courtroom. It belonged to the neighborhood now. What happens when the truth is too heavy for one person to carry alone? The tension reached its peak at the next emergency HOA meeting. Karen, out on bail, walked in like nothing had changed. Sunglasses, pastel tracksuit, chin lifted as though the world still bowed to her. The room buzzed with anger, but she thrived on that. She fed on conflict, twisting it into power. But when Pam stood up with the evidence, when Tom spoke about his child, when Mrs. Gable told her story about fines for a garden gnome, something shifted. The room wasn't just angry, it was united, and Karen felt it. Her smirk wavered. Her voice cracked as she tried to regain control. I should have felt triumphant. But then I noticed someone else in the back of the room. Gage. He wasn't supposed to be there, but he was. And the look in his eyes wasn't arrogance this time. It was something darker. Something that promised the story wasn't finished. When the meeting ended and the votes were cast, the neighborhood celebrated. Karen was officially removed, stripped of her crown, but I couldn't shake that look in Gage's eyes. And when I stepped outside, the cold air hit me with a truth I didn't want to admit. Removing Karen didn't remove the danger. Because people like her don't vanish. They regroup, they retaliate, and they wait for the moment you think you're safe. And that night, as I stood on the porch with Pam's hand in mine, I knew the storm hadn't passed. It had only shifted. The next strike was coming, and when it did, it would be aimed not at my ATV, not at my property, but at something far more fragile. The night after the meeting should have felt like victory. The votes were cast, the neighborhood had spoken, and Karen had been stripped of her crown. People walked out lighter, whispering relief like they'd just come up from under deep water. But for me, the air was thick, heavy, the kind you can't quite breathe. Because in the back of that room, I had seen Gage, and his eyes told a story the votes couldn't erase. He hadn't lost, not yet. He was waiting, watching, planning. Pam tried to celebrate. She poured us both a drink and sat on the porch, her face soft with the glow of triumph. "We did it," she said, her smile almost convincing. For once, the truth won. But my gaze kept drifting to the shadows across, the street, to the faint sound of footsteps that might have just been the wind. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to sit there and let the weight roll off me. But I couldn't shake the image of that letter, the one that promised the game wasn't over. The turning point came faster than I expected. 2 nights later, I woke to a sound that didn't belong. Not the hum of the fridge or the tick of the clock, but the sharp crack of glass. My heart slammed against my ribs as I bolted upright. Pam sat up too, her eyes wide in the dark. Then came another sound, the heavy thud of something landing on the floor downstairs. I grabbed the flashlight and moved silently toward the stairs. The beam cut through the dark, shaking slightly in my hand. On the living room floor, shards of glass glittered like ice in the faint moonlight spilling through the broken window. And there, half buried in the wreckage, was a brick. Wrapped around it with duct tape was a piece of paper. I didn't pick it up right away. My stomach twisted before my hands even moved, because I already knew it wouldn't be good. When I finally peeled it free, the words jumped out like fangs. You took something from us. Now we take something from you. Pam stood behind me, silent, her breath catching. She didn't need to say what we were both thinking. The ATV was one thing, but something from you meant people, family, safety. It wasn't about property anymore. It was about fear. I called the police, of course. They came, took photos, shook their heads, wrote notes on pads. They promised to patrol more, to keep an eye out. But their words felt thin, like paper trying to cover a crack in a wall. The officers left, and the silence that followed was worse than the broken window. Because silence meant we were on our own. What do you do when the fight is no longer about justice, but survival? The next day, Tom came over. His face was tired, his eyes dark like he hadn't slept. He'd heard about the brick, about the note, and he didn't waste words. They're trying to break you, he said. First your ATV, now you're home. They want you scared enough to back down, and if you do, they win. I wanted to argue, to say I wasn't scared. But the truth was, I was. Every sound in the night made me sit up. Every shadow on the street made me tighten my jaw. And the guilt I'd carried since the stroller incident grew heavier, because now it wasn't just about what happened, it was about what could still happen. What if Pam was alone when they came again? What if they turned their anger on Sarah, or Tom, or anyone else who stood up against them? That's when I realized something I didn't want to admit. This wasn't just Karen anymore. This was bigger, darker. The racket we'd uncovered wasn't just an HOA scam. It was a network of intimidation, and Gage wasn't playing by rules anymore. He never had. He was a man stripped of his badge, stripped of his power, with nothing left but rage. And rage is unpredictable. Pam wanted to go public, to take the evidence we still had and spread it wider. Local news, social media, anywhere that couldn't be silenced. If we shine a light on them, they can't hide, she said, her voice steady. The more people who know, the less power they have. But that decision wasn't simple. Going public meant exposure. It meant putting our names, our faces, our lives out there for anyone to see. It meant risking Karen twisting the narrative even further, painting us as liars, troublemakers, attention seekers. And worse, it meant drawing the fire even closer to us. I sat with that decision like a stone in my hand. My father's voice echoed in my head, telling me sometimes trouble isn't worth it. But Pam's words pressed harder. If we stayed quiet, we weren't safe either. Silence wasn't protection. It was surrender. I stared at the broken window, at the brick still sitting in a police evidence bag on our counter, and I made the choice. We would go public, not just because it was right, but because anything else meant giving in to the fear. The days that followed blurred. Pam drafted careful posts, attached clips of footage, highlighted the evidence with clarity no one could ignore. She reached out to reporters. She gathered the stories of neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak. One by one, people started stepping out of the shadows, but as the light grew brighter, so did the darkness. One evening, I came home to find Sarah on our porch, her baby cradled tight against her chest. Her eyes were red, her cheeks streaked with tears. She told us someone had followed her on her evening walk, a car crawling behind her at just the right distance to make its presence known. No words, no threats, just headlights that refused to leave her back. She had rushed home shaking, her baby screaming from the tension in her arms. I felt the blood drain from my face. The message was clear. If they couldn't scare us directly, they'd go after those around us. Karen had always played her games through others, but now it was worse. Now it was Gage, unhinged, reckless, and dangerous. How far would you go to protect your neighbors when the danger feels like it's stalking every step you take? That night, Pam confronted me. Not with anger, but with raw honesty. "Cole," she said softly, "we're past the point of no return. Whatever happens now, we can't go back to before. The only choice we have left is to push forward, no matter how hard it gets." Her words sat heavy in my chest because she was right. The line had been crossed. The brick, the threats, the shadows following Sarah, it all meant there was no undoing this. We were in it until the end. I started to see the toll it was taking on Pam, though. She still pushed forward, still organized, still strategized, but in the quiet moments, I saw her hands tremble when she thought no one was watching. I heard her whisper in her sleep, her body twitching from dreams she didn't share. The fight was carving scars into both of us, scars we wouldn't see until much later. The confrontation came the next weekend. I was in the garage trying to distract myself by tinkering with tools that no longer brought comfort when I heard voices outside, loud, heated. I stepped out and saw Tom standing at the edge of my driveway, and across from him, Gage. They were squared off, anger radiating between them like heat off asphalt. Tom's face was red, his fists clenched. Gage was smirking, taunting, saying words I couldn't quite hear but could easily imagine. Something about weakness, about fear, about babies in strollers. I rushed over, stepping between them, my voice firm but shaking inside. "That's enough." Gage leaned in close, his eyes burning with a mix of hate and satisfaction. "You think you've won," he hissed, "but you've just made enemies you can't handle." Then he turned and walked off, his laugh echoing like a knife across concrete. Tom's hands were shaking. He looked at me, his voice breaking. "I almost hit him." God help me, Cole, I almost lost it. And that was when I realized the true danger wasn't just what Gage might do. It was what he was trying to make us do. He wanted us to snap, to cross the line, to give him the excuse to twist the story back in his favor. He wasn't just playing with threats. He was playing with our sanity. What happens when the battle isn't about winning anymore, but about not becoming the very thing you're fighting? That night, Pam and I sat together in silence. The choice to go public was already made, the evidence already out. The neighborhood was with us, but fear still stalked our streets. The turning point had arrived, but it wasn't the one I expected. It wasn't about evidence or votes or even arrests. It was about what we were willing to risk, how far we were willing to go, and what we might lose along the way. When I finally spoke, my voice was barely more than a whisper. "Pam, what if this ends with us broken? What if fighting them means we lose ourselves?" She didn't answer right away. She just reached across the table, her hand finding mine, her grip tight and warm despite the cold running through both of us. Then she said, "Then we fight harder to hold on to who we are, because if we stop now, we're already lost." Outside, the night was still. But the stillness wasn't peace. It was the kind that comes before the storm finally breaks. And as I looked at Pam, at the woman who refused to bend even when her hands trembled, I knew the darkest part of this story was still ahead. The line had been crossed. There was no going back. The night after Gage's smirked warning felt like a weight pressing down on the whole house. Pam stayed close to her laptop, her eyes darting across screens like she was searching for something she didn't even know she was looking for. I tried to focus on fixing the broken window from the brick, but every sound outside made me pause, hammer held midair, my ears straining. It wasn't just the fear of another attack. It was the gnawing suspicion that something bigger was at play, something we hadn't seen yet. The neighborhood was quieter than usual. People waved less, doors stayed closed longer, and curtains seemed to twitch more often. Fear wasn't just creeping through our house, it had seeped into everyone's walls. And while the silence might have looked like peace to an outsider, I knew it for what it was, the kind of silence that grows when people are waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then came the twist I didn't see coming. It was Tom. For weeks, he had been my closest ally in this fight. The father whose child had nearly been run down. The neighbor who stood with me against Karen's abuse. The man who had stood at the edge of my driveway, ready to explode at Gage. He had every reason to fight with me. But one evening, just as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in bruised colors, Tom came to my garage, his face tight with something heavier than anger. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice low. I wiped my hands on a rag, already bracing myself. The way he looked at me like he was carrying a stone in his chest told me this wasn't going to be simple. "It's Sarah," he said. She doesn't want us involved anymore. She's scared, Cole. She thinks standing against Karen is just putting us in more danger." His voice cracked, and he shook his head. "And to be honest, I don't know if she's wrong." The words hit me like a blow. I wanted to argue, to tell him we couldn't back down now, not after everything. But his eyes told me something worse. He wasn't just repeating Sarah's fears. He was starting to believe them himself. "You've got Pam," he continued, "and she's strong as hell. But me? I've got Sarah and my son. If something happens to them because of this, I'll never forgive myself. Maybe it's better to step back before it goes too far." I stared at him, my mouth dry. Step back? Tom, they followed Sarah in a car. They threw a brick through my window. "How much further do you think they'll go if we stay quiet?" His jaw tightened. "I know. But what if by pushing back we make it worse? What if silence keeps them from crossing a line we can't come back from?" That was the first fracture. The first sign that even those who had the most to lose weren't sure if fighting was worth the risk. What happens when the person you thought would never leave your side begins to doubt the fight itself? I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I just nodded, though it felt like swallowing glass. Tom left, and as I watched him walk back to his house, I realized something terrifying. Karen didn't need to win every battle. She just needed to plant enough fear to make us question ourselves. That night, Pam noticed my silence. "What happened?" she asked, her hand brushing against mine. "Tom's pulling back," I said quietly. "He doesn't think the fight's worth the risk anymore." Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes dark. "That's exactly what Karen wants. Break us apart piece by piece until we're too scared to move." But it wasn't just Karen anymore. Deep down, I knew Gage was working his own angles. And the more fractured we became, the stronger his shadow grew. The second twist came a few days later. Pam, ever the strategist, had been digging through HOA records, cross-checking names and addresses with the fake compliance ads. Late one night, she called me over, her voice trembling in a way I'd never heard before. "Cole, look at this." On her screen was a document, one of the HOA's financial reports. It looked ordinary at first. Line items, maintenance fees, repair costs. But buried in the middle was a transaction that made my stomach turn. A payout. Large, labeled simply as Community Security Operations, and the name attached to it wasn't Karen's, it was Tom's. My throat closed up. I read it again, hoping I'd misread. But there it was. Tom's name, tied to money that came straight out of our HOA dues, funneled into the same account used for security operations. Gage's operations. Pam's eyes were wide. He's been taking money from them. Either he's deeper in this than we thought, or he's been playing both sides. I wanted to deny it, to say it had to be a mistake, a coincidence, anything but what it looked like. But the paper didn't lie. And suddenly, Tom's doubt, his hesitation, his push to back down, it all made a horrible kind of sense. The man I thought was my closest ally might have been tangled in their scheme all along. I couldn't confront him right away. The betrayal was too raw, too sharp. But the silence between us grew heavier. When I saw him on the street holding his son's hand, I couldn't decide if he was a victim of Karen's manipulation or a willing partner in it. What if the neighbor standing beside you is also the one feeding the enemy? The neighborhood felt smaller after that. Every wave from a porch felt suspicious. Every friendly word carried the weight of doubt. If Tom was compromised, who else might be? How deep did this go? Pam kept pushing forward, her determination harder than steel, but I could see the cracks forming. She was exhausted, drained from carrying so much of the fight. One night, she admitted what I had already feared. Sometimes I wonder if we're just building a case for people who don't even want to be saved. Her words stung, not because they weren't true, but because they were. The neighborhood wanted peace more than justice, and peace, even fragile, can make people close their eyes to the truth. The third twist came like a punch in the dark. A call from Officer Miller. His voice was strained, urgent. "Cole, I need you to come down to the station." When I arrived, he slid a file across the table. Inside were photos, surveillance shots, not of Karen, not of Gage, of Pam. She was sitting in her car, parked outside what looked like a storage facility. In another photo, she was speaking to someone blurry in the shadows, an envelope in her hand. I felt the ground tilt under me. "What is this supposed to mean?" I demanded, my voice harsher than I intended. Miller looked me dead in the eye. "I don't know. But someone dropped these at the station anonymously. If Karen's behind this, it's meant to make you doubt her. If it's real, you need to ask your wife what she's not telling you." I drove home in silence, the photos burning in my mind. Pam was waiting at the kitchen table, her laptop open, her face lit by the screen. She looked up and smiled faintly, but the smile faded when she saw the file in my hand. "Where were you last Thursday night?" I asked, my voice low. She froze. For the first time, she didn't have an answer ready. What do you do when the one person you trusted most may be keeping a secret that changes everything? The air between us turned heavy, thick with questions that had no easy answers. Pam finally whispered, "Cole, it's not what you think, but I can't explain it. Not yet." Her words cut deeper than any threat from Karen, any smirk from Gage, because now the battle wasn't just outside. It was inside my own home. I stared at her, the woman who had stood by me through every fight, every storm. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if we were still fighting the same war. The story had shifted. Allies were blurred, trust was fractured, and every step forward now felt like walking on shattered glass. The neighborhood wasn't just divided by fear anymore, it was poisoned by doubt. And as I sat there, staring at the woman I loved with questions I couldn't ask, I realized the fight had entered a darker place than I'd ever imagined. The turning point had come, and it could not be undone. The file with Pam's photos sat on the table between us like a live wire, humming with all the questions I was too afraid to voice. The silence stretched, thick and brittle, and every second made me wonder if I even wanted the answers. Pam's eyes glistened, her lips parting like she was about to explain, then pressing shut again as though words would only dig us deeper. I had fought Karen, endured Gage's threats, watched neighbors fold under fear, but nothing compared to this, sitting across from the woman I trusted most and realizing I didn't know what she was hiding. Finally, Pam pushed the laptop closed, her hands trembling.
"Cole," she whispered, "I swear to you, I'm not against you."
"I've never been. But there are things I did, things I thought would protect us that I couldn't tell you." The words stung. "Protect us?" "Secrets never protect. They rot in the dark until they explode." I leaned forward, my voice sharper than I intended. "Then tell me now. No more walls, no more silence. What have you been doing?" Pam's shoulders sagged, and for the first time she looked fragile, smaller even. "I met with someone at that storage unit," she admitted. "Not Karen, not Gage, someone who used to work under them. He reached out to me after everything went public. He said he had proof, bank records, contracts, things that could tie Karen and Gage to every shady deal they've ever pulled. But he wouldn't meet unless I came alone." Her voice cracked on that last word, alone. That was why she hadn't told me. She knew I'd never let her walk into that risk. I wanted to scream, to ask how she could gamble with her safety like that, but another part of me understood. Pam had always been the one who pushed where I hesitated. She was the reason we'd made it this far. But the thought of her sitting in the dark with some shadowed figure, trading envelopes like we were in the middle of some crime thriller, chilled me to the bone. What happens when the truth you've been fighting for is placed in your hands by someone you can't trust? Before I could press further, a knock rattled the door. Not the polite kind, but heavy, deliberate. Pam's eyes snapped to mine, both of us frozen for a moment before I moved to the window. It was Tom. I almost didn't open it, but his expression was nothing like the last time we spoke. He looked pale, desperate, his jaw tight as if he'd been chewing on guilt for days. I opened the door slowly, keeping my voice guarded. "What do you want, Tom?" He didn't flinch. "To make things right." We sat in the kitchen, Pam listening quietly while Tom spilled what had been festering inside him. He admitted he had taken money, yes, but he swore it wasn't what we thought. "It wasn't a payoff," he said, his voice trembling. "It was hush money. They threatened Sarah, the baby. I thought if I took it, played along, they'd leave us alone." He ran a hand down his face, tears welling. But all it did was drag me deeper. And I hate myself for it. The confession twisted my stomach. He wasn't innocent, but he wasn't the villain either. He was what Karen and Gage thrived on, a good man cornered until he broke. Pam's eyes softened, but her voice was steady. "Then help us fix it. Help us end this." Tom nodded, his resolve clear for the first time in weeks. "I will. But you need to know, Karen's not the one pulling strings anymore. Gage is, and he's planning something bigger than threats. He's desperate, and desperate men do dangerous things." The room chilled at his words. We had always seen Gage as the enforcer, the shadow to Karen's control. But with Karen out of power, Gage had nothing left to lose. That made him unpredictable. What if the enemy you feared most was never the one in charge, and the real danger has been waiting in the shadows all along? The next 48 hours were a blur of tension. Pam arranged to meet the whistleblower again, this time with Tom and me backing her up. We chose a neutral place, an abandoned park on the edge of town, empty swings creaking in the wind. The man showed up hooded, his hands shaking as he handed over a flash drive. "This is everything," he muttered. "Payments, fake fines, accounts overseas. Gage has been running it all under Karen's cover. But now, he doesn't care about money anymore. He cares about revenge." Pam clutched the drive like it was a lifeline. "Why are you giving this to us?" she asked. The man's eyes flicked around nervously. "Because I don't want blood on my hands. And that's where this is heading." His words clung to me even after he left. Blood. It wasn't just a figure of speech. The climax came that night. We returned home, tense but hopeful. the flash drive burning a hole in Pam's pocket. But before we could even process what we had, headlights swept across our lawn. A truck idled at the curb, rusted, loud, familiar. Gage's! I stepped onto the porch, heart pounding. Gage got out slowly, his grin wide, his hands too relaxed for a man who'd already lost everything. "Evening, Cole," he drawled, his voice dripping with menace. "Heard you been poking around where you don't belong?" Pam stepped beside me, her chin high, her voice steady. "It's over, Gage. We have proof of everything." "The game's done." But his grin didn't falter. He took a step closer, his eyes wild. "Proof means nothing if nobody lives to share it." The words sliced through the night, leaving silence heavy in their wake. My fists clenched, every muscle in my body screaming to act. But before I could, Tom emerged from the shadows of his porch, his voice shaking but loud. "It's over, Gage. Walk away before you ruin yourself completely." For a moment, the world hung suspended. Then Gage snapped. He lunged forward, rage boiling over, and everything erupted at once. Pam screaming my name, Tom rushing in, the sound of struggle echoing against the quiet houses. The fight was raw, desperate. Gage swung wild, fueled by anger, but Tom and I fought with something stronger, the weight of everything he'd taken from us. Every punch was more than just defense. It was years of silence breaking apart, but rage has a way of making a man unstoppable. Gage shoved me hard against the porch rail, his hand reaching into his jacket. The glint of metal under the streetlight froze me. A knife! Pam's scream tore through the night. And then, in a moment I'll never forget, Tom stepped between us. His arm caught the blade, the sound of tearing flesh mixing with his cry of pain. But that sacrifice gave me the opening I needed. With everything in me, I tackled Gage to the ground, pinning him as neighbors spilled out of their houses, voices rising, phones flashing, sirens in the distance. The police arrived fast, lights painting the street red and blue. They dragged Gage away, still snarling, spitting threats about how this wasn't the end. Tom collapsed against the curb, his arm bleeding, but his eyes steady. He had made his choice, and in that choice he found his redemption. What do you hold on to when the fight costs more than you ever thought you could give? At the hospital, as Tom's wound was stitched and Pam finally let herself cry into my shoulder, I realized the battle had reached its peak. We had faced Karen's arrogance, Gage's violence, the doubt of our neighbors, even the cracks within our own home. And somehow we were still standing. But one final twist lingered, sharp and unspoken. Later that night, as Pam finally slept beside me, I plugged the flash drive into her laptop. The files loaded slowly, pages of transactions and names scrolling before my eyes. And then, buried in the numbers, I saw it. My own name. Not once, but 3 times. Payments I had never received, logged under maintenance reimbursements. My chest tightened, confusion turning to dread. Either someone had forged my identity to launder their money, or I had been tied into their scheme without ever knowing it. I closed the laptop, my hands shaking. The fight with Gage might be over, but the real truth had only just begun to reveal itself. The emotional climax had come and gone, but the shadow it left was darker than ever. We had won the battle, but as I sat in the quiet, staring at the glow of the laptop, I realized the war was far from over. The glow of the laptop screen faded, but the weight of what I had seen lingered like smoke in my lungs. My name, 3 times, wrapped into numbers that did not belong to me. I sat in the stillness of our kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound, trying to convince myself it was a mistake, a forged entry, some desperate attempt to muddy the waters. But doubt, once planted, is hard to kill. And in that moment I realized the fight hadn't just left scars outside my door, it had sunk its claws into me too. The days that followed moved like a blur. Gage sat behind bars, charged with assault and a string of crimes that were finally catching up to him. Tom healed slowly, his arm wrapped, his spirit steadier than it had been in months. He carried his scar with quiet pride, as though it was proof he had finally chosen the right side of the line. Pam worked with investigators, handing over the flash drive, untangling the mess of accounts and records, her determination unshaken even when exhaustion left her eyes heavy. The neighborhood changed. People who once hid behind their blinds began to step out again. They spoke of Karen and Gage not with fear but with disgust, finally ready to admit what had been happening all along. The brick houses on our street looked the same, the lawn still neatly trimmed, but there was something new in the air, an openness, a willingness to stand together, and yet, for all that change, some things stayed the same. Fear leaves echoes. Nights were still restless, every sound outside pulling me from sleep. When headlights slowed on our street, my stomach tightened. When the mail arrived, I half expected another letter tucked inside. The scars of what we endured were invisible but deep, and I knew they would never fully fade. One evening, weeks later, Pam and I stood by the repaired window, the glass clear and new. She slipped her hand into mine, her grip warm, steady. "We didn't just survive," she whispered. We shifted the story, and that matters. I wanted to believe her, and in many ways I did. But the laptop still sat on the desk, the flash drive tucked away inside. And the numbers I saw, the ones tied to my name, haunted me in ways I couldn't explain. I hadn't told Pam yet. Not because I wanted secrets between us, but because I wasn't sure what the truth even was. Had I been dragged into their game without knowing? Or was this just the last cruel trick Karen had left behind? The cost of everything hung heavy in small ways. Tom no longer walked his baby in the evenings. He stuck to daylight hours now. Sarah spoke less, her smile softer but guarded, like a flame that could be snuffed if the wind turned wrong. The neighbors were kinder to each other, quicker to offer help, but you could see the shadows in their faces whenever Karen's name was mentioned. And Karen herself, she had slipped into silence. No more pastel tracksuits on her porch, no more letters stuffed in mailboxes. She fought her charges quietly out of sight, her empire in ruins. But people like her never truly disappear. They linger in whispers, in paperwork, in the fine print you don't notice until it's too late. Pam pressed forward, though. She spoke at council meetings, shared the story with anyone willing to listen, not for fame, but to make sure no one else would go through what we had. She carried herself with the strength of someone who had faced the storm and refused to bend. Watching her, I realized how much she had changed. She wasn't just my partner in this fight. She had become the voice of the neighborhood, the anchor when everything else had threatened to drift. On the other hand, found myself quieter. The man who once fixed engines to escape his thoughts now sat staring at tools that no longer gave comfort. The cost of this war had been my peace, and though we had won in ways that mattered, I knew I would never look at my home the same way again. One late night, I stepped onto the porch alone. The air was cool, still, the kind of night that would have felt safe once. I looked down the street. The familiar row of houses bathed in soft light, and for the first time, I understood the full cost. We had fought to protect this place, to expose the truth, and in doing so, we had broken something that couldn't be repaired. But maybe that was the point. Maybe neighborhoods aren't meant to be perfect illusions of peace. Maybe they are meant to carry scars, reminders of what happens when people look away too long, when silence becomes the easy choice. Tom joined me a few minutes later, his arm still stiff but healing. He stood beside me quietly, no words needed. We both knew what we had lost and what we had gained. He nodded once, his gaze steady. "We'll be all right," he said softly. "Not the same, But all right, and maybe that was enough. The final image I carry is this: the repaired stroller. Sarah kept it, though she had every reason to throw it away. She wheels her son in it each morning, not because she forgot what almost happened, but because she refuses to let fear take away what is hers. Every squeak of its wheels is a reminder that life, fragile as it is, keeps moving forward. The story of Karen, Gage, and the fight that nearly tore us apart is finished in one sense. But in another, it will never end. It lives in the cracks of our memory, in the lessons we learned the hardest way possible. It lives in the way we look at each other now, not as strangers behind trimmed hedges, but as neighbors bound by something deeper. And if you've stayed with me through this story, through the nights of fear, the betrayals, the screams, and the silences, then I ask you to do one thing. Don't let it stop here. Share this story. Talk about it. Leave a comment with your thoughts, your own experiences, your questions. And subscribe to HOA Truth Tales so more people can see what happens when silence is broken, when neighbors choose courage over fear. Because at the end of it all, courage is the only thing that keeps the lights on in the dark. And the last image I'll leave you with is simple. A window, once shattered by a brick, now whole again. Clear, fragile, but standing, just like us.